Well, thank you, Barbara. It's always good to have a friend introduce you for one of these, huh? I would just like to say thanks to the many colleagues and good friends who are here today, and just to say that it's actually those relationships that I think will go with you, and that hopefully will be with you when you end your career. Keynote addresses will come and go, thank goodness. I'll be glad when this one comes and goes. Keynote dresses will even come and go. Wayne discussed yesterday men and suits and armours, and he seemed to be saying that that was something that men did. Well, if he was here today, I would like to let him know that keynote dresses and high heel shoes can actually also quite feel like an armour, so we're there too. So I would like to say thanks to the colleagues and friends who've come along today, and especially to Steve, and a special thanks to Helen and Val and Susan for being here as well, especially here, so thank you. Now, yesterday was a very important day for AARE, and in acknowledging and committing to a stand of inclusion, we've started to try and make transparent, I think, the reckoning that's been going on for many, many years and is continuing and is still required to consider social justice and education as a pursuit, as a real thing. So I want to start my talk today just by saying that I understand that we are meeting on lands that have been part of the lives of the traditional owners of the Gadigal peoples, the Eora Nation, for many, many thousands of years. And I want to acknowledge that many traditional owners have fought and lost their lives in the protection of these lands. And for all of us, our lives today in this country are built on that sacrifice and that disposition. And in that way, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the elders past, present and emerging of the Gadigal peoples. And of course of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, elders and colleagues who are here in the audience and who are an important part of the association. I want to acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are important to our society and to education in Australia, and that we will all have better lives should we choose to be enriched by their knowledges and their understandings. And because I'm reporting today on research in the talk, I also need to acknowledge that I conduct most of my own research on the lands of the Yugambeh peoples, and I want to acknowledge their elders, and to be respectful, I want to make transparent the support that I receive to be able to work in other people's communities. I also need to acknowledge the executive and members of the conference committee and organisers. The annual conference is a crucial part of the association, and it's been just wonderful to be involved in such a vibrant conference over this last week. So thanks to Georgina and to her committee, and also to Kim and Simone and to Deb Cracknell for all of the work that they've been doing. Now, before I get started on the main part of my talk today, I also want to acknowledge a couple of other things. And I think they're really important to us as educators, as people who make our livings related to issues related to children and young people, communities, education in all its forms and contexts, and supposedly in being part of trying to make society a fairer and more equitable place. And because of that, I've become increasingly aware that it's really important to talk about issues of social justice at whatever place or moment you can, even when you're in front of an audience where probably many people are quite like-minded to you. Maybe that's the safest place to do it. So I want to take this public opportunity to remind us today that in Australia we have children as young as 10 in prisons, and I don't think that our education, our health, policing and justice institutions should have that as their only option for kids in need. And I want to acknowledge the injustice that a disproportionate amount or number of those young people are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, and this makes transparent the racism that remains as part of our society. I want to acknowledge that despite recent success in bringing some children and their families to Australia, we continue to detain recognised refugees and asylum seekers in offshore detention. That we continue to approve funding schemes that do not necessarily ensure quality education for all. And at the same time, we accept as quite normal that some cohorts of children will benefit more from school than others, and that results are predictable each time they are announced, and we accept them, and we continue to do more of the same. I want to recognise and acknowledge that there are current debates about who will be excluded from institutions of education based on their sexuality. Our laws should not be designed to allow discrimination, and where they are because of opinions from the past, we need to work to adjust those laws, not to use them as an excuse to disadvantage and disenfranchise. I want to recognise that our leaders not only think somehow that research related to humans getting on or knowing more about each other is somehow fluffy and unimportant, but also that they think it's okay to intervene in rigorous systems of review and award to make sure that particular sorts of research are not supported. And as an aside, that our leaders have a very particular idea about national benefit, and I'm a little worried about who gets to decide what that is. I want to also recognise that funding for universities is currently based on some weird notion that education is a commodity and students are consumers, and that this is resulting in work and study conditions that are becoming untenable for many and inaccessible to others. And I'd also like to just remind us that the world is currently dealing with a man-made disaster and that scientists are telling us that time is running out. And I think while the antics of racist politicians can sometimes end up as memes and GIFs that give us a bit of a chuckle, we should all be very aware of the seriousness of attempts to make legitimate the most advantaged claiming victim status, and many of our leaders being unwilling to call out discrimination based on race, class, sexuality, gender, in case it impacts on support in the electorate. Now, I'm very aware that saying these things is not going to change them, especially since I have an audience, many of whom probably have similar politics to me. But I increasingly think that it actually is important to voice these concerns so that we at least continue to think about them as we go about our everyday business. Now, 2 years ago, I sat in a room which I guess some could say is kind of very like this one, but in important ways it was also quite different. That room was at one of Australia's most iconic sporting spaces, the MCG, and of course this year makes a very deliberate return to a university space as a place where we hold our conference. Now, sure, some of this was driven by a move, at least in part, by a real need to ensure that the association lives a little frugally, or at least within our means. But to be honest, the financial benefits of being within a public education space are increasingly small, as universities have been forced, really, within a neoliberal education policy of being the holders of large, purpose-built public spaces with buildings that are usable and serviceable upon them. So most of the drive to ensure that we came back home to university spaces was because of a need to remind us about what our association stands for, and reciprocally to remind universities of who and what this association expects them to stand for. Public education spaces that work toward quality education for all is an ever important thing to champion. But I digress. 2 years ago, in a room a little bit like this one, I listened to Martin giving his presidential address on the morning of the AGM when I would move from being incoming president to president. And Martin talked about the exciting moment at the AGM 2 years before when he had taken over the president's role, and the terror that fell on his shoulders about a minute after that when he remembered that role would involve giving a presidential address. Well, it was about that time that fear landed squarely off his shoulders and onto mine. And to be honest, it hasn't let up since. I've been messing around with 100 different papers since then, and as it seems in my current work life, nothing gets finished without a looming or missed deadline. And as it got much, much closer to it looking like I might be doing an interpretive dance this afternoon instead of talking, I finally turned off my email and gave myself what increasingly seems like a privilege to actually think, to read, and to write a paper. Now, I think this consistent squeezing of reading, writing, thinking, analysing, critiquing is an issue worth commenting on. I'm not sure when it became the norm that a president of a large association, academic association, would feel unable to take the time to write a presidential address. It's kind of an interesting idea, isn't it? I think that most of us, when we decided that focusing on the idea of a job that included academic work, thought that we would always have time to read, to write, to think, to be creative, and yet increasingly the ways that time, scale, and for those of us having to deal with looming relocations to open plan offices spaces are configured in universities suggest that the academic dimensions of reading, thinking, writing, creating, innovating, designing are really no longer valued, except when it comes to promotion or evaluation. Now, of course, I know that I speak from a position of privilege. I cannot, and neither would I, claim otherwise. This year I've had the very great experience of working with a small group of members, Sophie Rudolph, Rosie Barron, Amy McPherson, Murray Brennan, Jane Kenway, Lou Zippen, who've been progressing an agenda around issues related to casualisation and workplace conditions that may well be challenging the opportunities for quality research, and I actually believe quality teaching as well within universities in Australia. And added to this, my own work with colleagues who are earlier in their career than me makes it very clear that the situation is changing for the worst, and early and mid-career researchers are in increasingly precarious positions as academics. But having acknowledged that those pretty grim conditions that these academics are dealing with, I do actually think that it is worth thinking about the state of academia more broadly too. The cracking pace, the attendance to administrivia rather than substance, valuing so little of what we think we actually do, but continuing to expect more and more. None of this seems to me to be sustainable, and as an association, as well as researchers of education, we need to care about these issues and take any means we can to find solutions and to support each other. Now, my first AARE conference was in Fremantle in 2001. At the time, I was just in my second year of doctoral study, so I've listened to a few presidential addresses over the years. Many start their addresses talking about the frustration of deciding what to talk about, how big does it need to do, should it include your own work, should you be making commentary, who gave good advice when you were whinging and bleating through the year. Well, I did do my fair share of whinging and bleating for sure, and I'd like to thank those colleagues who were lucky enough to listen to that. I am very lucky to have great colleagues and friends around me, and they were willing to stoke up my confidence, let's be honest, my ego, and I thank those people a great deal. They all know who they are, and I appreciate their support a great deal, both before and today. But it was actually Malahai Tambia who provided me with a little piece of advice that actually ended up letting me get a handle on pulling this thing together. During a supervision meeting for our shared master's student, Phil Poulton, I was having a bit of a bleat about the preparation, and Malahai said with a very straight face, just tell us something we know, something we don't know, and something we should think a little bit more about. So here goes. Something we know. Poverty matters. It impacts on the lives of children and young people. It intersects with race, gender, culture, language and accent, ethnicity, sexuality in particular spaces, cultures and locations. It is in collusion with the forces, very intentional forces, that work to stratify our society and that do so quite efficiently through our institutions and systems, including the institutions of schooling and education. And education, like everything else, of course, is changing. There's nothing new in that, right? Indeed, we've heard others say it in several of the keynotes, and I'm sure the other presentations throughout the week. For many of us, we see the effects of this each time we enter a research context. For at least some of us, we have experienced the effects of this in our own schooling and our own backgrounds. But it's still worth thinking a little more about the current context of education. A recent Oxfam report demonstrated that inequality in Australia was in fact worsening, not improving. This is despite what politicians are urging us to believe the opposite. The report is also supported by figures out from the International Monetary Fund. The number of billionaires, for example, in Australia increased from 14 in 2008 to 33 in 2017, with the announcement of Australia's Rich List. According to a recent report by Gareth Hutchins in The Guardian, over the period of 2008 to 2017, the average household wealth in Australia grew by just over 12%. And our unions tell us that wage growth has slowed to record levels and that this growth no longer or barely keeps up with rises in the cost of living. Now, considering that these average figures include those of us who continue to do okay, the figures tell a disparaging story for those living on low wages, those who are or underemployed, and those who rely on social and government support are even worse off, of course. Drawing on data from the Credit Suisse Association, Hutchins suggests that the top 1% of Australia's population holds more wealth than the bottom 70%, and this wealth inequality continues to expand. with the wealth share held by that top 1% still rising and that of the bottom 50% decreasing at an alarming rate. Of course, we now know that it's not just through underemployment that people are left behind. Not just by unemployment that people are left behind. Underemployment continues to impact on the life experiences, and wage share for many sectors of the employment matrix continues to drop in alarming ways. I think it's worth considering how these economics fit with social, cultural and spatial factors in Australian society, along with our very specific policies around school choice and school funding. We know that the free market works better for some than others, and we're still waiting for the promise of the myth of trickle-down economics. And we know that there is very little that is random about who is advantaged and who is not. So social class and the lived experience of poverty or advantage intersect with location, space, as well as gender, race, culture, religion, sexuality, language, in increasingly complex demographies, due in part to economic policy, settlement and hardship and migration. Before I move on to specifically look at education context, I want to just think for a moment about the idea of space and location and neighbourhoods and communities and how these fit with current educational ideas about outcomes, about who is in and who is not, and about how we represent that. And I want to thank Asper Barutzis for the images on the next couple of slides and for our shared thinking around them. The Vincent and Rawson report, produced with Beavis and Erickson in 2015, entitled Dropping Off the Edge. The report works to map geographic distribution of disadvantage in Australia and reported on what were called 40 of the highest ranking SLAs or statistical local areas. The study was not tasked to draw causal links, but instead just to uncover the areas of concentrated disadvantage in Australia. In the areas where I am privileged to do a good deal of my research work, there are a number of SLAs that rank on the Vincent scale as very disadvantaged. But what I want you to think about is that this community is not homogenous. So the red dots in the purple circle are actually schools where I work, but their red also signifies them as within the most disadvantaged in Australia. But what I want you to think about is that, as I said, this community is not homogenous, and the disadvantage is increasingly concentrated, and it's very possible to see that there are spatial and material conditions of this disadvantage evident. The purple circles on those two maps that I've just showed you signify the same space, but this aerial photo demonstrates an area of higher density, much less green space. In fact, the schoolyards are the only green spaces seen on this map within the purple circle. These schoolyards are now increasingly fenced with 9-foot black fences and locked during weekends. Residential neighbourhoods are mixed with industrial use, light industrial use, but industrial use, and surrounded by areas of lower density, larger, more affluent housing. Interestingly, many of the communities in this map that surround the area of concentrated disadvantage, represented by the purple circle, are gated communities now as well. So I guess my point is that space is much more than a dot on the map. There are socio-cultural and socio-material aspects to these spaces or places. They are meaningful locations where people live, where they engage and are engaged in belonging or not belonging. As social and material spaces, communities, neighbourhoods produce and reproduce the ways in which we can relate to other human and non-human elements of the spatial and social environs. And schools and education spaces are likewise involved in the production and reproduction of power, relations and politics, and they get to mediate relational, pedagogical and temporal and spatial movements of those within their boundaries and, of course, those who remain outside of their boundaries. The ways that we categorise aspects of space, though, in relation to outcomes and measures of disadvantage takes this one step further. And they've tried to, our ways of actually representing schools and naming schools have tried to represent issues of space and location and school populations, and we need to give them credit for that. And they do this in order to allow schools to be linked with others that are like them, so as to enable comparisons of schools with all others, as well as with a smaller group of other schools who are supposedly like them. Now, these listings of like schools give some confidence that the system of evaluation are fair, that they're equitable. So sure, right, our system understands that not all schools are the same. But here is a school that even when it is compared to other schools that are just like them, are still producing results that are substantially below its counterparts. So what is left to blame? Teachers? Children? Their families? Of course, what's missing in this narrative is any understanding of how unlike these like schools are. Any index, so it is not a critique of the index, any index, no matter how complex, will always prioritise some items and not others. It has to. And just as an example, in the suite of schools that provide this school with all of its red details, so red you can imagine is bad, it's possible to see from these photos that the spatial and how it might be implicated in the everyday lives and opportunities has not been captured. So these are the locations around 4 schools that are like, that we're now comparing, and you can see that the lives of children growing up in these communities would be quite different. So yes, poverty matters, and so does the spatial and the material conditions that people live in. So back to thinking about what all this talk about changing conditions of education could mean. Alan Luke recently described our present in a preface to his collected works on literacy, schooling and social justice. And he said, the future just happened to log on early. Policy and governance, truth and lies, and the boundaries between the legal and illegal, public and private, are now played out through Twitter exchanges where 140 character texts have become central media of news, public, policy and politics. The practices, parameters and standards of human exchange and communication are in rapid transition. Now, in this context, there should be few greater conundrums for schools and educational research and researchers than how to prepare literate subjects, people, with the means to understand, access, use, and work around the codes of messages of modern communications media in ways that make visible the links to power, capital, truth, and ideology in a world of increasing inequity across racial, gender, sexuality, culture, and economic divides, increasing shifts in the relationships between work, economy, and techs, increasing forced mobility, and where challenges for recognition may be called louder, but are less likely to be heard unless they are voiced by those who consider themselves to be the silenced majority. There are recent examples in our own political landscape of these sorts of calls for recognition, which I don't intend expanding on because I don't want to give it a visibility today. But I think it is important to at least think and to note that the legacy left behind once these statements are made, with all their racist, homophobic, sexist or classist ideological principles, once they've been put into the public discourse, it certainly does not leave a legacy behind where social justice is at the forefront. Now, while as I said, I have no intention of giving space to any of those statements by repeating them today, I thought it might be okay to provide a counter voice to those kinds of statements. I've recently found the views of Luke Pearson, who blogs as Indigenous X, to have a clarity of expression that's quite helpful. So I'll leave Luke's comments on a recent motion put forward in our Senate here for you to read as I proceed. In these contexts, questions asked by education researchers interested in social justice education, literacy and schooling must include questions related to how schools, educators and community members and kids and families might collaborate to prepare children and young people and their families and communities to engage in positive lives in difficult and constantly changing fast economies and social structures that have been designed to leave many behind in the interests of a few, and that seem to have small regard for the societal, environmental, cultural and health priorities that we've always assumed are important to us all. This will be no surprise to anyone in this room. And that's that debates about education, access and equity have durable histories. But seemingly, they are quite resistant to change and to logic. Public, political and even practical and academic debates tend to work in binaries, and these distort or simplify the complex and knotty problems of education. Because of this, to study education, we must do much more than consider teaching and learning, knowing about how best teacher can teach others, and how best people can learn under the instruction of others does not, or at least should not, define educational research. While these problems are very important, they should not represent the breadth of educational research. Education is situated within the broad social, political and policy endeavours of a society, a community. Now remember, we're in the tell them something they know phase, so of course I know that you all understand and know this, and that that's not a resounding statement to make. Many of us researching in education engage our theoretical and our methodological approaches to pursuits in educational research that ensure that we take into consideration the social, the cultural, the political, the economic context, as well as the spatial and the material, and how these relate to gender, to sexuality, to race, to language in which education takes place. This is part of what we do as educational researchers of all persuasions. And what that means, though, in terms of a pursuit of a socially just education system, is that we understand that underachievement, or how we measure success, whether in literacy, in STEM, in school behaviour, whatever, is produced by complex social, cultural, economic and policy forces. And curriculum and pedagogy constitute only one relatively small part of that. In the work of those outside of education, and while of course I'm not saying this to suggest that interdisciplinarity is not important to our work and to the discipline of education generally, but when other disciplines and understandings and perspectives are brought to the agenda of education, there is at times a certain naivety, to use the words of Lynn Yates in a recent chapter on education theory published in a collection by our members, John Key, Jennifer Bleasby, Stephen Stoltz, Marino Toscano and Scott Webster, and I would suggest, I saw it on the Rutledge shelf earlier yesterday, and I would suggest you go and have a look at that book, about the powers of assessment, curriculum and pedagogy. So we think that those things can do more than they are able to do. As I said, I see this in examples of those when other disciplines come and talk with authority about literacy education, my own field. There's a sense that shifting those levers of curriculum and pedagogy, or using a different test, or even just testing some more, will somehow have a direct and causal effect to improved outcomes, changed perceptions and new directions, new lives for students, particularly, of course, those from cohorts where disadvantage plays a part in the outcomes achieved. And it's just not that simple. And while assuring quality and equity in our approaches to teaching and schooling, we need to keep education, or the purposes and achievements of education, within the larger context of other social influences, which we know remain at play in the impacts and implications of teaching, of schooling and of education. Having said that, I do want, in the latter parts of this address, to consider what remains possible and what should be schooling, and those, including researchers who work within schools, should be encouraged to see as their accountabilities back to children, young people and families and communities. So quality teaching based in principles of social justice matters, but it is not the only thing that can be left to matter in our drive to achieve a socially just education. As I said earlier, a lot of my research work is conducted in communities where poverty continues to impact on the lives of those who set up relationships in and around schools. The schools I work in are great schools. They've got hard-working teachers engaging with great kids and families. But the current education policy landscape demonstrates what the effect of what happens when the approach is economic rationalisation of old structures and technologies developed in the pursuit of a modernist print-based schooling system. I recently reread Connell and colleagues' formative work on schools, families and social division, which was first published in 1982. I noted that these researchers argued that central government policy now tends to increase educational inequality rather than reduce it. So 3 decades on, and while the policy, the practices and the conditions of schooling may be different, it seems that so much actually remains the same. In the current policy landscape, there are common premises of accountability as testing, the positive power of standardisation as a representation of standards, marketisation of schooling in a competitive environment of school choice, central surveillance of teachers, children, and to some extent families and communities. For example, in interventions that tie social support for living to education outcomes such as attendance in some communities but not others, and in the intensification of resourcing in some sections of the school and not others. The early years of schooling and early phonics comes to mind. There's several assumptions holding these policy moves up. These include a belief that large-scale systems, approaches and outcomes can be quantified, that top-down systemic intervention to control and change school and teacher practice can be used as a lever to generate improved outcomes, at least those outcomes as measured by standardised tests. So the logic is that the work of schools and teachers and children and young people can be steered by monitoring the smallest of details of what happens in classes and schools and monitoring student performance. What is particularly distinctive in current policy, though I believe that we may not have seen in other rounds of policy change, is the official support being provided to a corporate political economy around pedagogy and assessment. These multi-million-dollar industry in scripted pedagogies, basal-levelled readers, synthetic phonics programs, comprehension cards, high-definition curriculums with matching teacher and student texts and tests. It seems that the state may have shifted its support from those trained in education to those trained in business and marketing of education products. And all of this in a context where we know that collaboration or collective action and not individual work will be required skills if the children currently in schools are to be successful in future work, recreation and civic lives. Where we are aware that the relationships between communication and power are shifting with the rise of writing as the technology of mass literacy to call on the work of Brandt, and where the material conditions of communication, the very relationships between people, things, texts, technologies of communication have shifted, and in a context where we've acknowledged that everyday life, wherever it is conducted, involves the entanglement of social with material, human with non-human, technological with traditional means and products of literacy and communication. From a decade of research in schools with my colleagues in communities, particularly those communities where recognitive and representative justice remain key challenges and where in most schools, but not all, access to new technologies continues to be problematic, and teachers and children don't necessarily have access to what many of us would consider to be fairly simple everyday technology in ways that make sense for current communication needs at least. I spend time in classrooms where all of these broader social factors come together, and the teachers and children I research with try to get on with their core business in these same very complex spaces. From surveys of teachers working in these schools, we know that the teaching populations are heavily weighted to young staff in their first few years of their career. Now, this is not to suggest that these early career teachers don't have a lot to offer the profession, nor that they are not real assets to the schools in which they work and the children and their families who they work with. But such a bias in any one school challenges the cross-generational networks that can be developed and capitalised upon. And in times of accountability and increased testing and surveillance, where standardisation and consistency have blown out, for those schools where many or even most of the teachers have only been teaching for just a few short years, there tends to be limited access to an institutional history, a memory of how things might be other. This has implication for what seems possible in these schools. And that this places schools like these at a disadvantage in terms of how they might push back, how they might resist on some of the mandated requirements that they know are not working for their children. It's hard to interrupt the logics of schooling if you've not taught in any other context and if you don't get to engage with anyone else who has. Of course, we also know that our young teachers, at least in Queensland, and I'm sure in other spots as well, are often in very precarious employment situations, being left on short-term contracts and not being made permanent for many, many years. So to recap, we know poverty matters and that our current schooling contexts continue to build on inequitable structures that continue to be, or perhaps are increasingly, inept for dealing with the problems of today's educational needs. We know that the current accountability context, where more data is collected through more testing than ever before, and where spaces for teaching of children with the purpose of moving along their learning are increasingly constrained. My claim is that in these contexts, in these current but somehow shifting and changing context, one of the key policy and practice dilemmas is how school systems respond to changes in demographic, socioeconomic, cultural, social, material, spatial and technological contexts, and at the same time provide their children with a useful version of quality schooling. And while continuing to work in the policy context that frames education as being about measurable and continuous improvement of outcomes on a narrow band of literacy and numeracy, and perhaps sometimes science skills. This continuous pursuit of improved scores is premised in most of our current policy, and this should draw us to think about the ideas of change and of complexity. So to move to something that you might not know. I want to take just a little bit of time to unpack two policy narratives that circulate and have circulated for time on time as logical stories about policy. And of course, narratives have resolutions, certain logics of how the world should be. Narrative one relates to using deficit explanations of failure. Deficit discourses circulate about children who grow up in particular areas, about their families and their communities. And of course, they also circulate about schools, about schooling, education systems as well. But deficit understandings work in ways that allow us to attribute blame for underperformance to individual or group deficiencies. They also ensure that the recognition of strengths, whether of kids, families, or even public schooling, is obscured. Individual characteristics or deficits are catalogued in essentialist terms and are then available to be generalised to groups and cohorts. We see this in statements about these kids, these areas, these schools. And this means that the rich lives of children and young people, their skills, capacities, and the intelligent ways that they go about their everyday lives become invisible. Evidence of individual deficiencies are generalised to the group, and where success or evidence to counter these deficit understandings can no longer be ignored, it is then considered to be about the individual, so it becomes an exception to the rule. Of course, these deficit ways of understanding children and concepts such as learning, education, are much more likely to affect individuals and groups who are already at the margins. White, middle-class culture is normalised and all else is othered and offered up to be explained in deficit terms. Once we believe that we can understand a child as a result of knowing others like them or others we have known, their family, their community, the easy next step is to know a child because of what we know about the background of other kids like them. Issues related to their learning become problems within the heads and bodies of these children and their families, and not as a result of the education or indeed the life that we offer up for them. The result of this is low expectations for ourselves, for education, and the ability to explain away the continuous low performance of children and young people without the need to consider institutions, schools, ourselves as educators. The second narrative relates to or standardises basics and narrows our ideas of the purposes of schooling. Based in assumptions that there is one best way to teach, whatever we choose to teach, one best curriculum or pedagogical approach that can and should be standardised across all classrooms, and that this one way to teach will likely involve direct instruction of basics, basic phonics, basic number facts, basic content from other disciplines. The second narrative runs a little like this. Current approaches, and we don't bother to investigate what current approaches actually are, but current approaches of teaching are flawed, and teachers cannot be trusted to be quality teachers, that the government can identify and implement a highly defined, standardised approach to pedagogy. In the case of literacy, this is currently basic phonics or systemic phonics instruction. I know those of you from other disciplines have your own problems and fights. And then we can use it to monitor the behaviours of children and teachers. That once this standardised approach is implemented, that progress can and should only be judged via standardised tests or assessments where children's behaviours and responses are measured, then placed on a bell curve and labelled as A to E, before being collected in ever-increasing banks of data, and that this will result in improvements in test scores, especially for those students who come from historically underperforming groups. In the end, both of these narratives undermine teachers and teaching. as well as children and young people and their families and communities, as they both narrow the purposes of schooling to being about the transmission of pretty basic content, and certainly, in most cases, to thinking the main purpose of schooling is about learning print-based literacy, perhaps a little basic number and science. As Melita Hogarth has ably demonstrated in a recent publication about speaking back to deficit discourses, policy narratives have a habit of ignoring the physical, political, cultural and social factors that influence school engagement and opportunity. These policy narratives work to shortchange children who could expect the best from an education system. But I want to move now to bust some of these assumptions and at the basis of these two narratives by focusing on children and young people and what they can tell us about. I'm going to spend, so what can children and young people tell us about the inadequacies of these simple policy narratives? I want to pick up in what follows also on the idea that there may never be a time when it is more important to tell counter stories that resist and reposition these narratives as well. Now, the reason I suggest that we might not know these things is because as adults, as teachers, as policy workers, as researchers, we tend not to ask children and young people what they think very often. Of course, I know that's not true of all of us as researchers, but I think it is quite fair to claim that in terms of the institution of schooling and education, we don't really listen to kids. In providing these short extracts, I aim to just give some insights from children collected across several research projects to provide us with a look inside what children can tell us about schooling. But at the same time, the data also challenges the assumptions that underpin the deficit narrative and the idea that heading back to the basics will solve any real or perceived problems with education. The following extracts come from studies of work that is done with others, so I want to make it very clear at the beginning of who I'm working with on these ideas. They are shared and collaborative. I'm going to be drawing on a number of research projects in my discussion. So, as I said, this is shared thinking, shared work with colleagues. The first instance of this is from a study with Barbara Comer, Lisa Kervin and Asper Baroutsis, and it's a current discovery project. Now, in this project, we've been interested in what happens when everyday literate experience is clearly about writing as well as reading, about text production across multiple modes, about our social institutions tasked with preparing children and young people for learning, work and leisure, have not necessarily caught up either with the importance of teaching writing or of the importance of communicating in a diverse range of modes that includes, but is not exclusively, about print. We're interested in this project in knowing more about both how children learn to write and how this learning can best be supported. We started with what we know about schools in high poverty communities and how in current times of intense technological and curriculum change, writing must be thought about as much more than an individual producing a print text. We are also interested in the relationship between learning to write traditional texts and producing texts within digital technologies. A focus has been on the material changes to text production and how we use text to communicate with others and how we learn to do these things. As teacher educators, of course, we've been very interested in curriculum and pedagogy and the implications for curriculum and pedagogy of the current context. We started from an assumption that it's not useful to separate print text from digital text, nor to separate our ways of working with them or researching them. We know that print texts have certainly not been made redundant by digital technology, but we're interested to know more about the implications of the material changes brought about when paper and pencils sit on desks with laptops and iPads, and when children look toward whiteboards and smartboards more often than butcher's paper and other charts. Our interest is in how this changes how children are and could be learning to write and produce texts in school. A very small part of that study has been to ask children about learning to write. We've asked them to tell us, to draw for us, and to engage in writing or text production with us. And they have told us rich histories about writing outside of school, and many, many stories about writing with relatives, with friends, in groups, and by themselves. Interestingly, the children almost all believe that they themselves are very good writers. And many discussed being happy to write or have told us stories about choosing to write in private or home time. This is despite the representations that they may have within schools. They also talked very much about others being good writers. They talked about writing with others outside of school, and many discussed their family members and family friends as being good writers. Parl and Rousel, in a recent Lit Review, comment that study after study has refuted the notion that poor, minority or culturally diverse families don't value or support literacy development. These findings of seminal work such as Shirley Bryce Heath's and many others know that there are many ways that families share literacy, and all are valuable to children's literacy learning. So while deficit discourses may be resilient and permeate the understandings of community that teachers and schools are able to have, especially in communities of high poverty, the children in our study have told us a very different story. Parents, brothers and sisters, aunties and uncles, grandparents are all mentioned as good writers, as people who help support children's writing and as reliable writing partners. When asked what they would like their teacher to know about what helps them to learn to write, there's definitely evidence of children learning quickly about what it means to be a good writer in school. There are comments about spelling, about neat writing, even the appropriation of teacher or curriculum language as children discuss learning intentions, neat writing, finger spaces, as well as telling us about engine tables and blue and red lines. There were even comments that made it very clear that children knew how to behave in order to be a good writer. I just think and I don't touch anything, and I listen to the teacher and I get a pen and I start quick and I write big and I put a full stop and then I put another one behind it and my teacher says, fantastic. But there are also a number of children that told us that what they'd most like their teacher to know about what helps them to learn to write was the time to practice or to think, as well as the opportunity to write about what is interesting to them. The children in this study have told us about, as I said, rich family lives, about families who are interested and who are good at writing. They talk about experiencing learning as well as using literacy at home and with family. These stories are quite counter to deficit explanations of children and families and literacy. Likewise, in terms of the ideas behind the purposes of schooling, at home, my mum and my dad. My mum helps me to write, how to put the letters and the full stops, and if I have a problem. My dad helps me to put words together and then to speak them out. So likewise, in terms of the ideas behind the purposes of schooling being narrowed to being only about literacy and numeracy, and even the most basic and narrow versions of that, young people seem to know better. In a study led by Marnie Shea and Grace Sara entitled Our Stories, Our Way, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander secondary students engaged in projects to educate and report their own communities on what they see as being crucial for the well-being of young people living in their own communities and also beyond. The research and ideas, beliefs and perspectives of young people were then eventually presented back at community forums. And this involves often the production of an artefact, sometimes textual or material, a song, a movie, much clothing, hats, other symbols. As part of the research, though, the young people are engaged in, and they're asked to consider and to yarn and to think about, to workshop around a number of concepts. One of these is their ideas about schools that create health and happiness, strength and outcomes. So the young people were asked to draw or write a plan of a school that would make them feel strong and healthy and happy. Overridingly, these young people have demonstrated very sophisticated understandings of what it means to be educated well, what they want from schools. And as we'd maybe expect, they have a very broad idea of the purposes of schooling. Analysing these My School drawings, we see that the young people are framing the purposes of schooling. They know that it is about relationships, that it is about learning, that it's about well-being, and that it is about good resourcing, whether that be text, humans, materials, the land and country, and working together. These young people know and have been very clear in telling us that a schooling system that teaches them basic phonics or maths will not be enough. Education must be more, schooling must be more. And finally, before we move on, I want to present a small piece of data that demonstrates that top-down, highly defined decision-making around curriculum and pedagogy does not necessarily encompass the most useful learning, nor can problem or inquiry learning, play-based and discovery learning be put aside as not useful and unimportant. In a study led by Margaret Somerville, with many others who were here this morning, we're interested in what happens when literacy and sustainability are brought together within prior to school curriculum. And the last phase of this study has involved working with teachers around pedagogical choices, reform, if you like, related to an area of both their interest and as decided from the data collected and analysed at their sites in the early phases of the research. The project that I've been working on with one teacher leader recently has aimed to puzzle what the inclusion of technology, resources and tools of both print and digital literacies into the outside play areas and spaces might result in. Basically, we've provided a variety of literacy materials, paper, pens, iPads, for children to take into their relatively free and autonomous play if they so choose. The ways that they decide to interact with the materials are not adult-led, and what else is used or what becomes part of the interactions that eventuate are also not directed either by myself or the other adults. The point has been to just think about the entanglements of human, non-human and of the digital that might eventuate when children have choices to engage with things, materials that they might not always experience in outdoor natural environments. The activities have focused, of course, on communicating messages. As this has been happening recently, the time of year means that the children are actually doing a lot of discussions about transitions to school. And I know that the iPads have certainly been talked about as part of getting ready for school. Interestingly, sometimes these materials have been really hot property and of high value, and at other times they have been completely ignored. But during one visit, children began to take photos using the iPads. They used some printouts of their photos from other weeks to construct some maps and representations using paper and pens as well. Some asked to produce books on the iPads and received instruction in using Book Creator to construct text. Amongst all of this activity, one child who was taking photos of a variety of things and showing them to a number of others with commentary, but who did not want to produce a book, somehow found the different effects, the tone, the light, the transparency, and to begin with, wanted to look at things that would look strange for the different effects. Interestingly, the researcher has been unable to find the settings switch, and the iPad still has these effects on them. So she's much cleverer than me. To give you an idea, photos that looked like this changed to this. She laughed a lot, and she encouraged everyone to join in on her looking. Shortly after, though, the situation became much more serious. She'd noticed that the colours changed when looked at through the different iPad lens, and so began a serious cataloguing of colours and what they were seen as through these lenses. Comparisons with light and dark versions of the colours to see if there were connections between them, and regular reporting of different discoveries to me and to others. She focused on people and clothing, natural materials, other communication materials such as pens, all the while making very loud claims about her hypotheses and the scientific rules and practices that she was proving and engaging with. This child knows that there is more to learning than just getting ready for what school might offer, and that there is more to an iPad than playing games, and we often don't trust children with iPads because they might play games. And she certainly has no notion of waiting for a lesson on colour within some predetermined content sequence before experiencing the bodily and the textual, the material practice of learning about her world. Each of these short extracts has aimed to demonstrate the inadequacies of policy narratives based in deficit or basic skills essentialisms. By listening to children in these research projects, we've managed to provide evidence that these narratives don't stand up even to the slightest critique. As Cope and Calancis reminded us in 2000, we may not be able to remake the world through schooling, but we can instantiate a vision through pedagogy that creates a microcosm, a transformed set of relationships and the possibilities of social futures, a vision that can be lived through schools. And that is the vision for a fair school that the children and young people in these examples are asking for. So now, briefly before we finish, something that we could all think a little more about. Over the past 18 months or so, AARE has been involved in a shared alliance with ATIA and ACDE through Cadre. The project is the first of its kind, we believe, in terms of these three associations coming together. And the purpose of the project was to consider what might be required to strengthen a research-rich teaching profession. The project was led by Simone White, with Joss Nuttall, Sue Shaw, Barry Downs, Martin Mills, Catherine Boosie and myself. The project aimed to think about what teacher education students, teachers, researchers, leaders and policy workers think about what is required to achieve a self-sustaining education system in Australia that is research-rich. There were a number of key messages from the report, not least of which the team telling the professional associations involved that an alliance of these three professional associations is possible and important. Currently, the three associations are in the process of considering what is most important to each of them, and of course they will take this forward in other strategies and research as their governing bodies see fit. But the thing that I'm going to ask us to think a little more about, a perspective that was brought up in several different parts of the data collected from teachers, leaders, policy workers, is the idea that partnerships and strong relationships across all those involved in the pursuit of a rich education system is necessary. The call was for integrated research partnerships that facilitate alliances between leaders, teachers, students and their families and communities, researchers, unions and teachers' colleges, accrediting boards and community representation from elders and educators in the communities. Now, we already have strong longitudinal examples of such partnerships in Australia. The River Literacies Project, first in place more than a decade ago when Barbara Comer, Helen Nixon, Phil McCormack and many others partnered with an amazing set of teachers and practitioner researchers to consider quality literacy education. That continues today in other forms and with a new generation of researchers. In Queensland, the Productive Pedagogies and New Basics movements, which engaged Bob Lingard, Martin Mills, Alan Luke, Deb Hayes, Jim Ladwick and many others in working with schools, school leaders and teachers toward new ways to think about curriculum and pedagogy. The work of Jenny Gore and others in quality teaching rounds and of course many, many other projects being led by many of us in the room today. These projects have demonstrated the strength of partnerships in contexts of school reform for social justice. The rhetoric around improving outcomes for all students continues to hide the complex and difficult work required to make sustained and significant improvements in outcomes for all of our students to achieving a high-quality, equitable system. There is no holy grail, and there is no one package that will do the work for us. The response must be just the right mix of local professionalism and informed prescription from the system. Teachers must have the space to teach. Students must have the space to be engaged in learning real stuff. But it also requires strong partnerships of engagement around research by all involved: educators, leaders, researchers, communities, children and young people. And for education researchers and educators involved in this kind of work, there is a need for a notion of impact that has accountabilities to students and their families and communities in the first instance, but also to teachers and the provision of a productive workspaces in the second, and to the system and greater public after that. My view is that school reform for equity is a matter of redistributive and recognitive and representational social justice, to call on the work of Nancy Fraser, balancing a focus on the equitable redistribution of resources, including those school-valued capacities, skills and understandings, and ensuring that there's recognition of the life worlds, experiences, values and beliefs of all children and their communities is important, as is the notion of representation, which foregrounds the importance of diverse groups having a say in schooling. And by this I mean a real say in the grounds of what education will be for their children. There seems to be This seems to be the way to progress towards a goal of high quality, high equity education system. One example of this that I've been involved in is the URL project. This was a 5-year school reform project that aimed to think about what school reform for social justice could look like when partnerships were foregrounded and in the context of shifting curriculum and pedagogical relationships and transitions from traditional print to technological ways of working. Our work in the school and the work of those within the school and around the school was to focus on collaborative planning and teaching with the aim of demonstrating and documenting teacher professionalism and quality teaching with students from linguistically, culturally diverse backgrounds and low SES backgrounds. It was not an intervention, and consequently, the team does not claim to have caused any of the changes that were evident there. We worked alongside of school staff, the leaders, the teachers, the communities around the schools to support their reform efforts. And we engaged in design experiments with them, with teachers and students to investigate pedagogy, and we ran and managed adjunct activities, an after-school media club, for example. We supported other activities in the school, the Indigenous Homework Hub as one example, through different programs, all based in building relationships. For example, Beryl Exley and Karen Dooley worked with John Davis to support the inclusion of teacher education students into the work of the community of the Indigenous Homework Club. Specifically, we went looking for indirect and direct effects upon conventionally measured achievement, outcomes and performance, working alongside of some really great teachers, leaders, kids and their families and communities. We supported their work. In theoretical terms, our emphasis in the project was on teacher professionalism and recognitive social justice, on building student capacity in new ways of communicating in order to provide new spaces for them to demonstrate gains thought of in traditional and new ways. There was no large-scale input of infrastructure, and as I said, we did not bring an intervention. But in this bottom-up reform project, we were able to demonstrate that reform was possible. Across a variety of domains, this school improved. Relationships with community, relationships with the system, they started winning awards, and even on NAPLAN results. By recasting one of our most popular debates, that being the current focus on teacher quality and responses that pit teacher against teacher and class against class. In contrast, a focus on pedagogy in this project enabled understandings and even accountabilities to take into account relationships and to focus on the main game of teaching and learning in schools. Now, building on such partnerships requires us all to have a focus towards ensuring there is space, time and resources to foreground broad purposes for schooling, to resist a narrow curriculum, to demand pedagogies that are a high quality but also well suited to the local context, to focus on children and young people and what they need to be taught in order to learn, to use assessment as a means to an end and not an end in itself. As educational researchers, we must encourage those educators, children and young people that we work with to critique and query, to problematise and puzzle. We must do this ourselves, to answer back and to ask for justifications for policy and practice choices. When we hear about evidence-based practice, we need to consider what evidence. We need to ask whose benefit when we hear about national benefit. We need to hold the line between having high standards and the push towards standardisation. To remember that schools need to be best for those who rely on schooling for the most, not for those who are already advantaged in every other dimension of their lives. Shape the education we want to have for our children and that we know we should be constructing for our own and other people's children, rather than accepting the system that we have. Conscious acts of dissonance and resistance as we work together as researchers and educators with leaders and teachers and children and young people, community members and families to design a collectively and collaboratively constructed school system that works and has a focus on what's best for all children. So are we there yet? Now, the question, of course, was rhetorical, but the answer, of course, is no. But I do think that we know where we need to head, the direction we need to take, and the drive and the energy that this will require. So as Joe reminded us yesterday, it is never too late. So as I finish and end my role as the president of AARE, I offer you this as the challenge. Thank you very much.